welcome back to another episode of Growing Pains. It's actually going to be the first episode of New Year for Growing Pains, so happy 2025, everyone. I hope you had a good holiday just now. But yeah, this episode's actually been stewing for a while. We did record it towards the end of last year, as anyone who's watching live will be able to tell by my hair. But I'll be joined today by Teemu Haila, who is the CPO and founder of Metaplay. Metaplay is a back-end game tech company that primarily deals with the live ops space based outside of Finland. And so if you are interested in live ops and understanding more about that space, definitely would recommend checking them out and seeing the game tech solutions that they built because it's really cool. But more broadly speaking, me and Teemu actually met back in October when we were giving a talk in Berlin, and I was just kind of blown away by the wealth of knowledge that he had on the games industry and especially in sort of the live ops space that he's kind of grown his career into. So it was really good to get him on here to talk about a lot of that and kind of more broadly looking at the management side again, which seems to be one of the big things that I'm very interested in. So this episode itself is actually split into two parts. We're going to start off talking about some of the live ops side, about his journey in games and sort of the insight that he's built there, as well as looking at some of the big European hubs that have grown over the last decade. So looking at things like Helsinki and Berlin. So it's just really fascinating to hear his perspective from, early mobile to today in terms of what's happened in live ops across that PC and console. And then in the second half, we kind of transition more into the leadership side where we talk about, how to hire, how to build, who to build for, all kind of the big game tech and business questions that I like to have on this podcast series. So I think there's definitely a lot that everyone can learn from him, and there's a lot of insight that he brings to the table, as you'll hear soon. And I hope there's definitely something that you can take away from this. As always, if you have any feedback for me, definitely let me know. And I'll catch you in the next one. Enjoy the episode, and thank you for listening. So yeah, thanks so much for joining me, Teemu. It's a real pleasure to have you on here. I know we had a talk last month in Berlin, which was more about games industry, but now it's, I guess, more Metaplay showcase here. So I guess just to start me off, can you just give me a quick background about yourself, intro about yourself, and what led you to Metaplay?
Yeah, absolutely. So um, I'm wondering what's like a nice a short version of it. Been in the industry for maybe around 16 years at this point, and I sort of got uh, started way back when founding the first online games communities for Finland, sort of from a community angle.
Hmm.
We started hosting forums and so on because none of that was really available back in the day for like RuneScape and Counter-Strike and so on. And it's all been downhill from there, really. So ended up studying something like interaction design because game studies weren't available. So
Yeah.
then I ended up founding Finland's first game development clubs.
Oh, nice.
And from out of that, we worked with teachers and so on to set up the first non-profit companies on top of those clubs for people to be able to do game releases and kind of help form the first games curriculums in Finland together with kind of all the relevant players and all that. So that's sort of like a very roundabout way of getting into games, trying to like
I mean,
find my way through the education.
I think that's most of
um,
us, right? Before it was established, like you said.
yeah, exactly. You just kind of try to make most of it in wherever you are, and then obviously finally end up in development. So did my master studies in Scotland. Ended up
Nice.
moving to Berlin to be one of the first mobile game leads at Vuga back in the day when Facebook games were all the rage.
Hmm.
And kind of mobile, nobody knew what mobile was going to be at that time. So sort of relatively early into mobile free to play. That's where my career has been ever since. Moved back to Finland to found a games company called Playraven that we did for about 7 years. It was acquired by Rovio back in 2017, if I recall correctly. And then instead of founding another game studio, I was really annoyed by sort of why making games is so hard. Like
Yeah.
obviously, making games is very hard, but it was on the borderline of too hard from an
Hmm.
entrepreneurial point of view. Like, the failure rates were just absolutely insane when you go into free to play specifically. And then at that point, one of the linchpin problems that I had when thinking about founding a new games company was that building the necessary technology to really even get failing, if you will, to get prototyping and iterating on the design Even that was in the tune of like maybe 2 million euros at that time, just counting a couple of people's salaries over a few years, like all costs included, right? And like that's what you do just to even get trying if your idea makes any sense. Like that was just too much. So then off of that premise, we ended up founding Metaplay. So we're a backend technology company um, to solve very specifically that problem of let's make the technology that everybody in Finland and by extension most of the world ended up building in-house for themselves so that you can actually afford to make new kinds of games to not end up in this like deadlocked industry where
Yeah.
it's too expensive to try anything new. Yeah. Sorry, a bit of a monologue, but
No,
like
no, 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 that's
that's
good.
roughly the
I mean,
path.
you got a stacked CV there, you know. It's always good to hear from people who've got kind of that sort of large knowledge base. It's like, you know, you can see the progression throughout as well, so it's really cool. I mean, before we go specifically into the tech, I did want to ask about a few things you said there in terms of, so I mean, you started, you know, building these games communities, and you transitioned into mobile. And I
Yeah.
just wanted to know, what was the perception like back then, and how's it kind of grown? Because like I remember when I first started, like my first studio, which was in PC console, a lot of people came from mobile, and they had a
Mm.
very negative sentiment about mobile. So like, how did you, I guess, go into that space? I mean, obviously, I think you're coming from more of an incumbent PC console-ish background in terms of games before you started, because that's what was there. This is really like mobile has
Sure.
just started. So what made you transition to that, and how have you seen that space
Yeah.
grow?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. It is interesting, right? Um, because I got into games because of Monkey Islands and Civilizations and Final Fantasies
Yeah.
and whatever, which are kind of PC console experiences. So that's the image I had in my mind of what games are in a way. But funnily enough, in Finland we had a very strong mobile development community because of Nokia.
Yeah.
Right, so Nokia
Oh,
basically
okay.
bankrolled the Finnish industry for a very long time. But so we sort of had very high quality role models, let's put it that way, both in companies and individual developers who found excitement from the limitations of a mobile device. That's a really interesting design target, has always been. Um, and from there, when the iPhones came out, then which was roughly when I entered the industry as well, um, that just kind of supercharged the technical ability to make games. Like you could use Unity fairly quickly down that road. So like the games became real games, if you will, in terms of just like raw capabilities of richness of interaction, like 60 FPS input, no latency, like they feel good and so on. And then at that time, there was no idea of what are the best practices on mobile. Like, is every single game gonna be a marble run type of game because the accelerometer seems fun, or is every game gonna be flight control because that like drawing seems fun? What's gonna happen? And then really the kind of games as a service or was born out of the games as a lifestyle, like games as a companion hobby that complements your life instead of something that you kind of stop your life for and go to a computer and disappear for 2 hours. Like even that concept was completely unexplored and was kind of born at that moment. So just like having all of this whole image in my mind, it was extremely exciting to go and explore that. Also, as a young person coming to the industry, I didn't really have the, as you say, the PC people still do look down on mobile quite a lot, which also means that they didn't really touch it. So there
Yeah.
was a lot of room as a new people to come into the industry, and as it turns out, mobile and free to play, it's always been good business in terms of like games. So there was also sticking power to have sort of a career start from that angle. Of course, it's interesting because how has it developed since then? Um, I don't think mobile itself is like mobile maybe as a platform has been fairly stagnant for a long time, but what works on mobile is the games as a service thing.
Yeah.
So there's like long meta game hobbies and how do you build multi-year structures, and those are in no way mobile specific. Mobile
Yeah.
just happens to be the place where they iterate the fastest. They're cheap to do, good platform for that genre, so on. And now I see that very strongly going, this year, next year, the year after. Games as a service is going to be absolutely dominant on every single platform in terms of revenue, in terms of funding. of like new projects and
Yeah.
thus developer interest. So interestingly enough, like mobile was the birthplace or maybe the place of refinement for this thing that is going to be dominating our industry. So it sort of hatched to be a lot bigger than what it used to be. Um, yeah, does that make sense?
No, no, I think that makes perfect sense. I mean, I've also done the rounds in mobile and then PC console itself, so I've also seen sort of the whole breadth. And like you said, like I mean, when you first start out, I think it is better not to have almost that stigma because I think it's very
Yeah,
prevalent in the industry. And I mean, a lot of times mobile and the games as a service hasn't helped itself because you definitely do have predatory monetization. I think that's something that's, I guess, almost the downside of what's evolved through that space. But like
yeah,
you said, it is there across the board, right? Like a lot of this, I think, what mobile really opened up was sort of this cross communication between the world in a way because a lot of these free to play gotcha those kind of elements they were really very like Asian centric. And
yeah.
so Western studios kind of adopted that, and then I think in the West we had much heavier like ads monetization by comparison, which was
We
the other
have different
side.
tastes, right? Like
Yeah.
you're right. I also played the early Korean MMOs and so on, which had a lot of the systems that we then kind of ended up reinventing on mobile. And obviously we had like Habbo hotels and so on in the West, which were like
Hmm.
our own takes on it. Um, but you're right. Like what I find interesting about that is that yeah, people have tried like almost everything that you can try, including the most predatory monetizations or like weird targetings and what have you. And what's emerged from it, I think, is beautiful in the sense that we sort of know at this point with conviction that, for example, Skinner boxes do not exist in games. Like that doesn't work.
Yeah.
If it did work, you would have a top 100 list of only that. But it's not true. Like the top 100 games are really good entertainment, highly polished, super interesting creatively, and at the same time, they end up having sustainable business behind them. And obviously, the fact that whale monetization was kind of it ended up winning, right? Because of how our society works and so on. So like all of that got experimented on super quickly. So it's been like a constant learning every
Yeah.
single year. On like, but it does also feel like it has like the industry has consolidated a lot in sort of what
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
designs work at the moment. And there are clearly winning design patterns, which I
Yeah.
find profoundly boring as a designer, but also, there's some kind of rules to every era of gaming.
No, that's true. That's true. And I guess I mean now, like you said, that these technologies are going cross-platform. You're seeing, I mean, obviously with things like Genshin starting off the PC, mobile, console, like whole conundrum, we're kind of going more into that. A lot of service games coming out PC console side as well, on the web as well again. So it's kind of almost become this Frankenstein's monster of how things are coming together in the industry. And part of that's also we're seeing mobile also, like you said, being stagnant but also declining. Where I think it's
Mm.
projected that other apps are going to overtake mobile app revenues or at least get to even values, whereas it's before been something like a 70-30 split to mobile games. So we are definitely seeing sort of this game ecosystem just shift, especially now post COVID, as we're kind of entering this weird phase of industry correction in a way. I guess what are your thoughts in terms of where we're going with mobile and seeing these techniques being adopted into kind of bigger games, especially because gamers have less time. I think one of sort of the news reports that worked on before was saying that only 8% of total playtime goes to new games. So if you're building like a big service thing, whether it's a mobile PC console, like it's hard to get people to see this stuff. They've already got their incumbents like your Fortnites, Roblox, all that. So what is the space for these like games as a service products, especially when you're having multi-year investment cycles and like crap ton of millions of pounds, euro, dollars invested into these?
Yeah, I mean that is the literal billion-dollar question for
Yeah.
new studio. Um, yeah, I mean that um, it is I think like a very somber fact, maybe like thinking about what you just said from a entrepreneur point of view, acknowledging that um, the competition has never been as fierce as it is today because um, the service style product allows the games that are hot right now to be like absolutely just like massively huge in terms of the amount of content, the amount of polish, the kind of size of the communities and so on. There's a lot of pulling power of like why you would want to stick with one of those games that you've maybe sunk a lot of time into, and you have your vested progression in that game, you have your friend network in that game, like all of that, right? Those forces have existed from before as well, Call of Duties or NHLs or whatever that are like the thing for your peer group. But now it's just even more, and the games are free for most of your
Yeah.
friends. So in that context, like how do you compete? Um, so first of all, what gives me hope always is that this is nothing new, right? Like this feeling has always existed, that it's always been really hard, and there's always been the incumbent that feels like they dominate the platform in some way. Funny anecdote from my point of view. While I was at Wuga, I was working on a game called Diamond Dash and Bubble Island. They were arcade titles, and that was at the time when arcade was I would say like a top crossing genre. The best performing genre of mobile was arcade in general. It was PopGap and Vuga and some other companies that were doing like Bejeweled and so on. These like massive genres.
Yeah.
This was before Candy Crush. And at that time, everybody knew for a fact that the only games that can work on mobile are going to be arcade games, because the arcade games were top crossing, which means that it was the ultimate genre and every other genre is inferior. Why would you ever make anything but an arcade game? Because clearly that is the beating formula. Then Supercell released Heyday and Clash of Clans. Um, and I remember the day they came out, and there were people in their office kind of talking about them, and the consensus was like, this seems fun, but it makes no sense, because like why would anybody play a game like this on mobile when clearly mobile is for arcade? And then it took maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks people to go, holy crap, like this is amazing, and like look at their numbers. And then it took maybe half a year for people to understand that combat builders are the pinnacle of mobile, and making any other genre is a fool's errand, because combat builders are better than arcade, and arcade was the best. So that means that combat builders are like S tier, amazing. Nothing can be better than this because it beat everything else that came from before. And rinse and repeat this cycle 2 or 3 or 4 times. When the next new things comes around, nobody was able to forecast it. It beats everything else, and it always feels like you have no choice but to do the leading thing because it's beat everything else. So this is to say that
Yeah.
when we look at today, we have this feeling that there are certain types of games that dominate the news waves on PC console, for example, whether it's Fortnite or something else. And it's really difficult to look at those and somehow extrapolate what could possibly be better, because these things have beaten everything that anybody else has ever done, war zones and so on. But people will get bored. They absolutely will get bored. And the trends will move on. And the next generation of gamers will always hate whatever the previous generation likes, and so on. Like
Yeah.
this is like this slow but powerful trends that will force a change into the industry. But the thing is that we can't really know what the next one is. What I do know, to set a bit of it's not even a prediction, but more like an acknowledgement, is that to have a phenomenon, to design not just a game, but a social phenomenon, it has to be something that is absolute mass appeal, super accessible. It doesn't mean that it's the lowest common denominator or anything, but it has to be something that's available to people, blah, blah, blah. That means that it's generally free to play or free to access somehow, so that you get the momentum in. It's generally cross-platform, because there's no technical barrier between the platforms. It's more about do we put in the effort to adapt the controls and UIs and so on. And it has to be polished enough that it withstands sort of direct comparison and makes for good ads and so on. So the creativity matters more, but polish does matter. And now we're starting to discuss fairly large budgets at this point, which means that it is likely, from my point of view, that the sort of AAA quote genre will continue to be the thing that people mostly try to do to capture their attention, and then try to hold on to the attention that you find, and then since it was so stupidly expensive to do and you needed to make it free to play anyway, then you're gonna try to do an overtime monetization games as a
Yeah.
service thing to it to capitalize on the success and try to make it as long term as possible. So then you will be looking at in-app purchases and ads and other like monetization opportunities around it, and you're gonna be looking at heavy live ops pipelines to design systems that you can keep up to date and make them feel relevant and use it almost like a platform
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
experiment with all kinds of content. So like, we're making game systems that are like platforms of entertainment because that is just the best way to recoup and justify that heavy investment of a AAA-esque, whether it's mobile or whatever platform
Yeah.
first
No, I
type of
think that.
development. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly where like some of the existing platforms have succeeded so much, right? If you look at your Minecraft, Roblox, even Fortnite now, like they've added this element of UGC, right? Giving people investment within that game world by letting them essentially create their own games and democratizing
Yeah.
that to an insane level. And that's why I think they've had such sticking power is like, they had the initial pull through of what this game is with the season packs and all that stuff. But eventually they just opened it up to let essentially people play with the actual mechanics, with the actual world itself. And I mean, you have
Yeah.
entire studios built on things like Roblox that are earning money from this. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that just goes to show the power of like having an open ecosystem where you can kind of do so much on top of what's already there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that that's just I'm pretty sure we're going to see an endless amount of attempts like that
Yeah.
because first of all, it's kind of interesting. I mean, it's fun, could be fun. It's worth doing from a game design point of view. And also, if it succeeds as a business, oh my God, it's going to be so good business. Which also
Oh
means
yeah.
that it's available for VC funding and so on. You can try on somebody else's money at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
and so that's how this stuff has always worked. So then it's just what I feel like it kind of quickly gets into this um, like threshold of insanity that as I think about it, of like how insane do you have to be to even to be very convicted you have to have a lot of conviction on do I really want to sacrifice 5 or 6 or 10 years of my life building a company around this
Hmm.
idea and trying it out and pitch for the marketing and so on. And to what I find is that people generally have a very so like even amount of insanity in them for this kind of stuff. Like you have very few people who just disregard all the risks. Like everybody's finding some kind of
Yeah.
edge, some kind of spark that makes them try it. And sometimes it's easy access to capital. Like maybe VCs are interested in games at the moment. They're not. Maybe
Hmm.
it's some kind of new platform that maybe has like an interesting opportunity, empty space in the
Hmm.
market.
Hmm.
We don't have that at the moment. Maybe it's an interesting new marketing angle that maybe you have like a fun way to go to market or unique access to an IP or something. Well, that's what people are exploring
Yeah.
nowadays with the lack of better alternatives. But like you find some kind of spark like that lowers the required insanity just to a level that you can tolerate, and then the business case otherwise is there if we're motivated enough to try and capture it. So it's
No,
a yeah,
absolutely.
it's a very interesting market at the moment.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's just crazy, and I think that's also the flip side of that in a way is, like you said, you need a lot of money for this, but going back to kind of the point of trend chasing, going back to the kind of investment that you're going to need for this, and then also putting in the factor that a lot of the innovation and new trends or kind of new mechanics that are being tested are coming from indie games, is kind of even a more, I guess, extreme in this current market where it feels, especially in Europe, because that's like I guess what I'm seeing around me. There's just so many kind of safer bets being placed right now. There's always like kind of the reboots, like the next game in a franchise. There's very little, especially when you're looking at these kind of bigger studios when they're looking at mass investment. There's very little going towards almost a space of innovating from sort of an industry first, like heavy area. It's really coming from kind of the smaller players where they're actually trying things, and then the bigger companies come in. Oh, that's cool. We'll just add that to the existing game pipeline that we have, and like just maximize on whatever's there, right? Like we saw a lot of that with things
Yeah.
like, I mean, we also talk about this with roguelike. So it's a lot of
Yeah,
that
yeah.
where the bigger companies almost feel like they're afraid to innovate in this market or afraid to take those big swings and risks. So, I mean, do you think with that in mind and the fact that you need those companies to be building these massive platforms, I guess is there anything you see there that you're like excited about, or I guess afraid of in terms of what's happening with this kind of trend of like the industry going to extremes between indies versus AAA?
Yeah. Well, yeah, there is a lot happening. What I think is, first of all, always like a positive thought around all of this is that if you look at Steam
Mm,
as an example, there is a fairly steady stream of an indie game going viral
yeah.
with and being extremely highly rated, as in that the game somehow fit some kind of itch that you didn't know that you had in a way that, and it might be almost like a small poem rather than a bigger product, but suddenly we have this steady stream of relatively small ideas becoming important to people, and when something is important like that, then it gives you an option to do a version 2 of it, which is
Hmm.
maybe a very more developed idea of the thing that you can take further as a business mayhaps, that
Yeah.
you already have an audience for. So you're shortcutting the whole game in a way, that you already have an audience that you're developing for. You can justify your investments. You can justify growing your studio. So I feel like there's, from an indie point of view, I know it's a lottery because it always is, but at least there is this constant movement up in a way that we are
Mm-hmm.
getting new stuff in, even though it's a completely like crowded marketplace and red ocean and all of that. I think my favorite example there personally is how Shapes, the game, was like a love letter to Factorio and
Mm,
became fairly successful, cost a couple of euros in Steam.
yeah.
And off of the back of that, they did Shapes 2, uh, which is a very, very, very different class of a production. But suddenly it's a sequel to a thing that was very small, but now the sequel is it's a proper game with a proper price tag, and it's amazing. So, I mean, that absolutely is gonna keep on happening and offering some kind of lifeline, at least for the indie community to grow constantly. That the AAA can't sort of beat them down all that much. That said, um, I feel like the publishers are gonna AAA publishers, AA publishers are gonna be in for a ride for the next few years because
Yeah.
the odds of success are so low that it's easy to go bankrupt.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. I mean,
because as a publisher, you're not in control of the go-to-market anymore. But that used to be the big thing for publishers, right? I know this is a bit of a tangent to your question, but I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it's
No, I mean,
important.
I think it's
We,
good.
we, yeah, yeah. And we had this segment of business that was all about go-to-market. That you,
Hmm.
as a
Hmm.
developer, make a game, and then you work with partners that can take you to market. Nowadays, those partners can no longer take you to market because they don't control the platforms or the access to those platforms or anything. That's been democratized and or killed, depending on how you look at it, like Apple or Google point of view, that there's not much of a
Yeah.
platform there, really. Um, so then this segment that is historically a huge funder of new projects suddenly have no appetite for risk, as you were saying. It's not because the audience went away, or it's not because there's no appetite, in the market per se. It's that their particular way of doing business is no longer viable
Hmm.
for everybody at the same time. They're all struggling in parallel.
Yeah.
So I think that's what you would just call like a supply chain shock in a way, that the shock is hitting them at the moment. Too bad for them. It's gonna even out at some point. We don't have to do anything about it, but it does suck imminently for project funding in particular. I don't really hear almost anybody doing project-based funding because the odds of success are so low.
Hmm.
But what you do have is a huge amount of capital for scale ups of all kinds. Obviously, that's easier in free to play and so on, where you can pour more
Yeah.
money in and get more success out. But it's the fundamental idea of like, oh, you have something that seems to work for whatever reason. Don't even tell me the reason. Here's my money because it seems to work. Please follow up on your success and let's take it somewhere. So at least in this sort of struggle, if somebody manages to make something that has resonance, then they will find the funding and partners to
Mm-hmm.
take it further. So what I would assume happens, like you can call me in a few years and tell me I was completely wrong, but what I would assume would happen is that that would incentivize um, more of these almost like production company
Mm-hmm.
style
Mm-hmm.
setups that kind of scout constantly what is happening in the market and like what is becoming popular, what is
Mm-hmm.
going
Mm-hmm.
viral in any way, and then figuring out how to make that into a professional, bigger production, and like using that as an approach to funding projects instead of the more classical era. Um, which is actually more favorable to indies or more studios in general who
Yeah.
can try to try to play that game or are better suited to playing that kind of game.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, even if you just look at, I guess, this breakout hits of the year, things like Helldivers 2 and then Palworld, all this, like these are mid-sized, like double A games, right? These are studios that, they've clearly had some
exactly.
success in the past, and then they've grown to the point where they've got investment from the incumbents of the bigger studios, where they've, I guess, almost been the ones that are taking the risks on the higher scale side. And I think that's
Yeah.
definitely a trend you're seeing growing, especially since
Mm,
there was no other kind of mass titles this year almost. So
mm,
yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that is sort of the path we're seeing is, like the indie gets in and then proves its traction, gets more funding from that point, has bigger ambitions, is still the one that still has enough of a risk appetite to try and build something new. And then they become kind of
yeah.
double A and scale from there. So we're seeing a lot of the innovation stuff really being driven on that end. And I mean, yeah, same on your point of publishers. That's the, it's almost like that industry was one that was essentially just built on asymmetric information, right? Like the whole point was you come in, you do
Yeah.
like marketing and go to marketing strategy, and now it's like kind of gone. You can kind of get out on Steam, so it's almost like why do we go to a publisher anymore except for the funding, right? Like especially with the term sheets
Well,
changing.
absolutely. And even especially on the games as a service area, I think it has been even more brutal, right? Like mobile publishers almost never became a thing.
Yeah.
They were a thing for like 2 days, and then they all went bankrupt or got bought or wanted to exit that slice of business because turns out when you're working on a games as a service game, and again, my thesis is that basically all games are going to be games as a service if you look at the bigger segment of it. Then to be successful in there, you as a studio need to absolutely internalize your own analytics and your own audience and own that dialogue so that you can be really, really, really good at it. So if you work with an external partner that has that abstracts away any of the problem space of going to market, then you're going to be worse as a studio because you're going to have less information and then you're extremely unlikely to succeed from there on out. It's like developers need to be super good at this stuff. And there's almost no room to actually externalize the what publishers used to do in that setup, which I find interesting. You can still outsource art and you know some amount of writing and definitely the audio. Maybe you can get some externals to handle some of your code for some of your SKUs on some platforms, stuff like that. But then you can like basically never, ever, ever completely externalize your branding and your analytics and that sort of stuff because that's your business. Um, so yeah, again, even when we go into the AAA side, I would vastly assume that it's going to be the biggest publishers having absolutely massive in-house teams that kind of build that knowledge by themselves, or it's going to be private equity funded, whether it's through
Mm-hmm.
Tencent or VCs or something else, to build that specific team for that specific project, and then it's
Yeah.
do or die. Uh, but there's very little room for having focused games teams that would then somehow hand off their projects to another
Yeah.
aspect of the company and say, now you figure it out. That just doesn't seem to work.
Nope.
I'm happy to be proven wrong there, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Well,
I would assume that trend just like accelerates from here.
yeah, no, definitely. I mean, let's see. It's gonna be definitely, I think, an interesting couple of years for the industry in terms of the correction that we're going to face and what this is going to lead to. Because I think there's so many people out there now without jobs, and almost like setting up their own little indie studios or new studios, and you have so much talent. I think you had games like Spectre Divide come out by incumbent teams. So there's a lot of just different things happening right now, and I think like this influx of games, both from young talent and incumbent talent, over the next 5-ish years, which is probably when we're going to start seeing some of the results from these last 2 years come out. is just going to be insane. So I'm excited and I guess cautiously optimistic is probably the best way to phrase it in terms of where we're going to be going from this. But yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, switching gears slightly, kind of going completely different here. But like, I did want to. So one of the things in your background that I find a little bit fascinating in terms of just having gone around the world in different parts of the industry is that like a lot of your experience seems to come from I guess the Berlin, Finland, like that ecosystem, which was very mobile games heavy, like driven. I guess because Supercell, we also briefly talked about that. But I mean, just talk me through the ecosystems in Finland. Like you said, you were there pretty much from ground one, building it up, and then Berlin as well. Like, what was there in these ecosystems that I mean, I guess you saw as kind of a unique things in the games world versus other places?
Right. Yeah. What's in the water, as they say. So I think Finland had, but we've been asking this ourselves, obviously, and trying to understand if it's something that we can export. Help, for example, VC funds
Hmm.
kind of bootstrap other games ecosystems and so on. And but like as in, we would like to be able to export this if we can. Um, but it's super unique as everything always is. I think Finland has three things going for it historically. First one is obviously Nokia, because
Hmm.
again, they predate Supercell by a lot, and they brought in sort of the hardcore know-how into mobile platforms and programming, and just like put in the actual raw money to pay people's salaries for tens of years for them to get comfortable and establish businesses in the area and so on. That gave birth to companies like Sumea, that was later became Digital Chocolate by Trip Hawkins, and the DChoc founders then later on went on to found Supercell. So there's a
Hmm.
fairly direct connection there. And other companies like Hyper Hotel was mentioned and all that. So that was extremely important. Then it's the demo scene. So demo scene is this art of competitive graphics programming and visual art,
Hmm.
essentially. So we had a very, very, very strong subculture of people pushing the boundaries of what you can do with a computer in terms of music and art and so on. Um, and that sort of combined with the university level interest in the hardcore deep tech of Finland has given birth to SSH and MySQL and
Hmm.
Linux and a
Yeah.
lot of the sort of common names. So if you kind of combine those things, then you can kind of maybe see this like latent interest on like doing something if if you get the right project to come along. And then there's the third aspect that Finland, weirdly enough, has this Finnish design. The design aesthetic is usually called arrogant design, meaning it's
Okay.
highly minimalistic. It's focused on like opinionated ideas that are not necessarily good, but they have personality in them, right? Like it's not the
Yeah.
Danish hygge of comfortable things. It's more German inspired, like Bauhaus and those
Okay.
movements. So I mentioned that because then when we get to say games, you need to have the deep tech know-how, you need to be very creative, you need to have some amount of industry experience to not make the obvious mistakes all the time. And as it turns out, in games, quality beats quantity most of the
Hmm.
time. So then sort of the Finnish aesthetic is to try to find beautiful systems or like simple ideas and craft them well. That's something that comes a bit easier. So when all of that comes together, you suddenly have a lot of people who enjoy their time in the industry.
Yeah.
And then the community side of that ended up bubbling up through IGDA Finland.
Hmm.
So IGDA, of course, has a kind of varied reputation across the world, especially
Yeah.
the UK, historically not all that amazing. Um, but in Finland, ended up being very, very strong. So it was just a flag, a banner under which people go to a bar and start hanging out. So we've always had this very strong connection between individuals working in the industry. So as we say, we compete for the employees, but we never compete against each other as companies because Finland
Hmm.
is so small. We don't have our own market for games. Like it makes zero sense to make Finnish games,
Yeah.
financially speaking. So we've always felt like we extremely openly share all of the learnings up to source code, like whatever, we just like share it all in a bar because there's only upside in doing that.
Hmm.
So that over time has developed a very sort of healthy relationship between the people and the even middleware providers like us, like vendors, to kind of just talk to developers and get a lot of feedback and share ideas and whatever it is, it kind of works out well. Um, so then the Berlin scene is interesting uh, because when I went in, my subjective experience was that there was basically zero community in Berlin
Yeah.
because Germany is divided into a couple of very strong cities that heavily compete against each other,
Oh yeah.
and the AAA hating mobile dynamic was very strong in Germany. So the strong companies like Crytek and so on had nothing to do with the mobile scene, socially speaking.
Yes.
Um, but then Berlin was very strong in like the old internet startup era. Like they
Mm-hmm,
participated in the
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
dot com bubbles and had successful internet companies. So there was a lot of know-how in how to say organize a company that could do A/B testing and do all these new ideas that were not done classically in games at all. They sort of came in
Yeah.
and that was a good mashup. So they accelerated a lot. And actually nowadays, I'm super happy to say that they do have an IGDA chapter in Berlin,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of startups, and they all talk to each other, and it's an amazingly good vibe. So it feels like Finland ye olden days in a very good way
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm,
they're
mm-hmm.
gonna aiming for the same thing. I hear Barcelona is very similar, and I haven't
Yes.
experienced the Istanbul ecosystem, but I also
Mm-hmm,
hear that
mm-hmm.
that's it has a similar flavor to it. But I think maybe that's a bit of a European trend at the
Yeah,
moment.
I mean, I think so. I also lived in Berlin and doing the startup thing back in like 2018. It was like a huge startup hub, and it's just interesting to hear you speak about that because it's like all these places you're seeing almost this drive, like you said, to have some innovation, drive to like you said, build things, right? Like for me, when I moved to Berlin, I definitely got this sense that everyone was trying to kind of reinvent themselves, and the whole city was essentially just being rebuilt by ground up by essentially
Yeah,
tech enabled people at the time. So in terms of just startup ecosystems and hubs, like all these places from the ones you mentioned, even like Barcelona, Istanbul, like I think that's a slightly different study, just from a wealth perspective in terms of why, and you're seeing that with them primarily being mobile hubs in terms of why they're going in that focus angle to, I guess, have better
mm,
revenues because it's more sustainable. And I think that's more Eastern Europe and East trend in general where the service games can just lead to a very fruitful career. Whereas I think, yeah, places like Berlin, Finland, even the UK, like we have less of that coming monetarily alone. And it is just this thing, especially Finland and Berlin, from what I'm hearing, is about the building and about trying to do something differently from what's already there.
yeah,
So yeah, no, I definitely agree with that point because that's definitely my vibe with Berlin as well. I mean, that's why I love the city is because like it still feels like there's that passion to do things, whether it's in tech, whether it's in games. And I mean, that's why you've seen some of the biggest, I guess, mobile studios and kind of even just SaaS companies come out places like Berlin and even Finland. I think Finland's a weird one now though because like it's essentially established, right? Like it's like Supercell has driven that industry to its kind of peak success in a way, and we definitely see that in games in general where you have one big incumbent and then it just kind of goes off the back of that where it just decides, hey, we're gonna all move here because you have one big company. So I think that's just a big trend in games where you see this where everyone kind of just becomes a follower, whether it's with trends or with anything else.
yeah. Well, I think in the Finland case, um, I would maybe propose that yes, Supercell they absolutely lead and can pull the industry in many ways. But at the same time, it's a surprisingly balanced mix because Remedy and Housemark have always been there for the console side.
Mm-hmm.
They're not extremely financially successful in the same way that say the USA AAA or UK AAA companies are, but they are extremely sort of well respected,
Yeah.
locally speaking at least, and obviously very very successful in their own right. Um, and then Rovio was with Angry Birds,
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
they had a very sort of different style of a game, and they've had their own sort of adventures. Recently got acquired by Sega, but they were sort of a very 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 major pillar almost of keeping people in the loop, doing animation movies of games, like very
Yeah.
next level
Yeah.
branding type of stuff, cross media. Um, and then we've had a fairly large amount of foreign companies set up offices in Helsinki. Obviously, Zynga did the
Mm.
latest Farmville in Helsinki when they acquired Small Giant Games, and EA has always had a big studio with SimCity Build It, which was their number one free-to-play game for the longest time. Maybe still is. Um, so that helps. So that from an
Mm.
ecosystem point of view, that people can move from company to company as things come and go. At the moment, I believe Metacore and Supercell have been most aggressive in recruiting lately, but also that there's gonna be the next company, and then
Yeah.
keeps
Yeah.
keep the cycle going.
Yeah.
But it's
I
also
mean,
interesting that it's extremely difficult to hire. So
oh,
it
okay.
as in it takes a lot for somebody to move to Finland, put it that way, and especially
Yes.
from the States. Um, so they need to have again a very good reason to do that. But even so, most new positions are filled with foreigners instead of Finns because
Interesting.
they have such a small talent pool. And if you think about the kind of people you need, then you generally don't imagine a fresh student or
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
somebody on the
mm-hmm,
second
mm-hmm.
or third year of the job. You imagine a senior. So the whole job market is also in a bit of a weird bubble. But luckily enough, the international market is big enough that you can always hire from somewhere.
Yeah.
But it is getting a little bit more and more and more detached from what's um, or getting more like polarized in terms of just the community being in their own corner doing new things, or these super senior people, 20 years in the industry, trying to push the envelope and not a lot in the middle. So there's all kinds of interesting dynamics happening,
No,
at
definitely.
least, the how I see it.
Yeah.
Um,
Cool.
Although I'll briefly maybe name drop our company at this point because that's one trend that I've seen, of course, at times like these. There's been both from a VC point of view, but also just me observing our fellow entrepreneurs. A lot of people are, instead of making games, trying to solve whatever is their favorite
Mm-hmm.
problem around game development. So for us, it's lowering the barrier of entry into the highest end of like live service games through the backend systems and live op systems and so on. But then it's also the same thing in like customer support or maybe AI driven whatever.
Yeah.
So that at the moment it's a really interesting explosion of tools being made, and that's only ever a good thing, of course, for the industry.
There's something I wanted to dive into what you just said there. It's really interesting is kind of on that hiring factor. I think it is just becoming so hard to find good talent. I mean, we're having a lot of people coming out of uni, and then, even with, I guess, the mass spectrum of lots of layoffs, all of that, maybe that makes it a little bit easier to find people. But like I said, it's a sort of very diluted pool, and it's hard to find, I guess, a very specific set of skills and people. So, I mean, you've done this for a while. You've led a couple of companies yourself. How do you approach the hiring factor and what you're looking to hire for? Like, what is, I guess, the secret sauce there? Because I think that's something everyone really struggles with, right?
Yeah, of course, hiring is it's always the most unquantifiable thing. So think of it from if I just think of it from a Metaplay point of view, which as a tech company instead of a game studio, um, but I feel like it's similar to a game studio, but especially for us, I find like the ultimate secret sauce obviously is that you want people who are extremely motivated to learn new things because it's
Mm.
kind of rare uh, for us, but and also even in games, it's kind of rare for you to do the thing that you have already done before and just like do it again.
Yeah.
Like you're kind of rarely on your absolute comfort zone, just plowing on. I'm sure those roles exist, as in I know there are places in studios for artists or certain types of programmers, and you kind of just get them to say, go and implement the shaders again. Uh, you know, slightly different math, but fundamentally do the same thing, or like optimize this engine again. But that's a very,
Mm.
very small sliver of the problem space. So
Yeah.
basically, you want people who you can just like throw at a problem, and they will climb that hill or like tell you when they want to stop or like something. They'll go and figure it out for you so that you can think about something else at the same time. So that requires quite a lot, but this, what I just described, does not necessarily come with seniority. It's almost like a personality thing rather
Hmm.
than an experience thing.
Yeah.
I do find that it more correlates with senior people in general. Maybe it's just because of like survivor bias that to be a senior, you generally have to have learned this exercise at some point. So, you're better equipped to go and do new things because you have a larger knowledge base and all
Mm-hmm.
that. But some of our best hires have been straight out of uni that have just had the right mind in a way, the curious mind. Um, so that's always the upside. But that said, it generally always means um, go, that if we the only thing that we can really hire for is a very specific spec, uh, so that we can make sure that we are able to describe the role well and be able to have a good match. So that we need to have a good spec so that an applicant can see it, see themselves in it, and apply for it.
Mm-hmm.
So that already implies some specific set of core skills or something, like a specific history in the industry or something, instead of just saying, "Hey, are you motivated? Are you smart? Let's try it out." Like that, you can't make that kind of that kind of
Yeah.
process doesn't really work. So it still remains a hard problem. Um, that said, I think everybody generally would rather have a small company than a big company. I feel like
Yeah. Yeah. I
basically
mean,
everybody says that.
it's
So
easier to manage.
it's easier to manage. It's a more fun team dynamic in general because you're able
Yeah.
to not just from a human point of view, which obviously matters. It's fun to know your coworkers on a deep level and so on. But if the smaller team you have, then the more effective the team is at solving whatever
Yeah.
problem that they're solving in general. So I feel like everybody is just constantly trying to find a way to um, make really big things with a smaller amount of people. And I think
Hmm.
also that's why people are piling on AI and the
Yeah.
magic promises for AI so much because it feels like a step function in how small we can be as a team. And I'm even, but of course, I do a lot of programming, but also I do a lot of writing and sort of boilerplate stuff around the office. I'm constantly trying to experiment with AIs to kind of find me a secretary to just like allow me to do more of the work that has impact without having to hire another person to,
Yeah.
take something away from me. Like it's that that's like half of hiring is trying to avoid hiring by getting more clever about the tools or whatever that we
Yeah.
use.
No, absolutely.
Um,
I think we've definitely seen AI as sort of this component of expediting teams being able to do more with less, essentially, and getting rid of some of those support functions that you don't always want want to
yeah,
hire for because you never know. And I think just on the flip of that as well, like with the hiring, with especially when we were talking about the bigger teams, you also get almost this layer of, I guess, people, especially I think what I've seen in middle management, where they come in into especially a scale up from a bigger corporate, a bigger environment where things move a bit slower, and it's hard to bring somebody from that cultural mindset and experience set into kind of a smaller or growing team because there's just a very different culture in terms of how you work across these systems. And I've definitely seen a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
teams sort of lose a lot of their efficiency, lose a lot of their momentum, and even like morale when this
yep.
happens because you get these people that are just used to working in a very different way, and that sort of starts to distill into the culture of this company that's maybe fast moving or growing. And it's just a very weird counterbalance to equate those two things in a company, I think. So especially as you grow, I think hiring seniors and leads is always a really tricky balance from every kind of scale up I've been in. It's I don't think anyone's ever gotten it right really. There's always kind of
Yeah.
a mess of, you know, this thing of existing teams for some reason find it hard to promote their existing employees because that's the thing, right? Like if you get money, you're like, hey, we want the big fish that everyone else in the market values rather than training up our own talent a lot of the times.
Well, it's true, and it's obviously also the natural thing that if somebody's really good at what they do, and you feel like you have a good enough like workflow and balance, you kind of don't want to disturb that, or at least you put a heavy premium on trying to keep what works, and then like additively try to take some other problems away, which generally just like that. It's a beautiful idea, generally doesn't work. unless you're talking about like freelancers,
Hmm.
in which case you're way more prepared to basically come up with processes to say, right, I'm going to externalize this problem and I'm going to have very heavy design and feedback processes to make sure that the inputs and outputs work out. And that's kind of what people have in their mind when they think about hiring somebody. It's like do that, but without any of the effort of like, I don't want to put more effort into this. I want to hire somebody to put effort into it so that the problem goes away, which never happens, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's the eternal problem there. Um, I do find it interesting that, especially again in the world of games as a service, the people who are good at making this stuff, so founders and
Hmm.
small teams that get started, they generally are not the people who are good at scaling the games company beyond the
No.
time. So there ends up being this sort of transformation at some point, whether it's on a team level or a company level, um, that needs to be actively managed at some point. Ideally with good communication and good intent, so everybody's in it. But like basically saying, you prototype people, you did a beautiful job, and now you need to grow up and actually make this a business. And then a lot of them will probably acknowledge after some discussion, say they actually do not want to do that because that's not what gets them excited and up in the morning, and they don't want to sit in meetings optimizing A/B tests and whatnot. But some other people do. So let's figure out how to transition this thing intentionally rather than stumble through it. And
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think there's a
um,
big founder mode versus manager mode discussion right now in startup land. So I've definitely heard the
Yeah.
rumblings of that, and I agree. Like I've seen a lot of companies sort of almost stagnate or fail because founders weren't able to transition, or because like, and on the flip side, where managers came in and they were also inefficient and weren't able to necessarily lead the team that they were with. I think there is like I think Nuzu, which is a company I used to work for, is a great example of this, because when I first joined, we had the founders in charge. They were in the process of essentially selling the company to exit, and they actually bought like an existing person over from Activision, and she became like the new CEO. Over time, there was like a year transition phase, and it was messy. It was really tough, but the company was still growing. And I think, I mean, just as a founder, for one, I respect that they had, I guess, the foresight, or I don't know if it was one foresight or two. They're just like, oh, this is too big. I don't want to manage it anymore. So it could be either or. But the fact that they were able to almost let go of their baby and be like, yeah, I might not be the best person to scale this, to make it more of like a hierarchical culture, or one that can actually scale into more of a corporate environment, which is what this company kind of needs right now as it's growing up with the number of people that we're hiring and all of this. So
Yeah.
I think that's one of the rare cases where you see that transition, and I think it's a very different company. It's a very different
Mm.
company. It's very different to when I first joined versus what it is now, and I've definitely seen that in the people that are still there as well. Like it
Yeah.
does not feel the same at all, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not necessarily a bad thing. It's just it's become a more traditional company. It's less of the startup vibe, and a lot of those startup people have then left. So I think you've also got to
Yeah.
account for the fact that like people will churn in a transition like this, and it is just one of those. I guess I know downsides of growing up in a way is like some people want to stay children, other people are like, nah, we just want to play grown up all day. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is a weird thing.
The way I like thinking about it myself is using sports analogies, not because I'm into sport, but because it is a winner takes all hit business that is extremely high performance driven, relies a lot on the individuals, and has been researched a lot. So we have a lot more knowledge about performance management in sports than we have about performance management in tech or in games. So I kind of personally like to think about games startups, including ours, um, as a like a high performance sports team that the team is bigger than any one of its players or managers, right?
Hmm.
That as you get started and you work your way through the different leagues and like find a way to become a competitive team, whatever that means, and then develop towards your like winning aspirations, then it's okay and to be expected for that team to have different managers over its life cycle, have different like star players, and so on, as long as it's all intentional and everybody knows what we're aiming for. So then it's no longer churn, it's more like participation. Um, so maybe some people are there for 20 years, that's fine. But
Yeah.
it's also absolutely fine for somebody to be there for 3 years. And it's not then like a 3 years in failure. It's more like 3 years and you helped us, take a step as a company. Amazing. Thank you for your service. I hope to work with you again in another context, maybe even in the same company later on. Who knows,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I felt that attitude is more descriptive of a company with sticking power,
Yeah.
and that fits in the kind of the model of games. I really like how Supercell is doing it. From what I see from afar, of course, I don't see inside the company, but they can afford to have a huge amount of game teams in parallel. A lot
Yes.
of them being new game teams that are in the more experimental phase, and a lot of them are very established, mature, and they are able to cycle people between the different teams, in and out of the existing teams, and so on, to expose people to what it's like in the different roles, and learn about different things, and get so the individuals become more T-shaped, so they have their specialization, but they do know
Yes.
what it's going to be like in the live ops era of an established game, or what kind of problems do you have if your UI systems are still built on top of Adobe Flash and like 20 years later, or whatever.
Yeah. No, I think there's just
But
a lot that you learn, right, from having, I guess, a spectrum of how different functions work and being able to work with these teams. Like, I think that alone is just such a valuable skill for anyone to develop, especially if you want to kind of grow in your career and go towards like a manager side, like one of the communication side, but also recognizing that different teams work in different ways, and that the more knowledge you have of kind of cross-functional players, like it just makes you so much more valuable and it lets you move so much faster because you
well,
understand how these teams work.
absolutely, especially in the smaller game teams, like we were sort of discussing these trends of, if you were to want to be in a smaller game team, then you're going to be working on something that's so much bigger than your team, that your team has to be able to stretch their abilities in like way beyond any specific
Yeah.
a specialty that people may have, which I feel is never been as easy as it is today, mostly because we have amazing learning resources for almost any discipline that I can. Um, as a dumb example, I used to do the shader optimization of some of our PlayRaven iPad 1 games or something, iPad
Wow.
2 games. And that took me quite a long time at the time to kind of from zero to start learning the shader languages and get the math right and so on. Today, give me half an hour and chat GPT and like I'll have that shader for you.
Yeah.
So I
No,
can
it's
accelerate that same path so much nowadays. And that
yeah.
reduces the cognitive load on me as an individual so much that now I'm able to then use the rest of the energy on some other problems so that we can kind of cycle through many hard things without them feeling so hard for me. So I feel like that's really fun for a small team nowadays, which emphasizes that if you're able to be clever about how you work, then maybe you do have an edge in the market. Like maybe you are able to
Yeah.
do that game that others aren't able to do. That's maybe real-time multiplayer, which is technically hard. But since you're able to learn it quickly, you're able to do experiments with real-time multiplayer, for example, or whatever it may be. Um,
Yeah. No, I think we're seeing a lot of that, right? Like it just comes down to kind of your point of you need to be a little bit flexible. You need to want to learn and grow, and I think that's really sort of the key factor. Whatever stage you are in your career, especially with technology moving so fast, you need to be able to kind of adapt to it as well. But I guess on a lot of that, and especially with like I guess Metaplay, bringing it back to that, how do you decide what to build? Like how do you iterate? I mean, like I've also done. I'm also a product person, so it's always interesting to hear from another kind of product mindset, and especially someone who's a builder like that. Like how do you? I mean, how did you? I got how you decided to make Metaplay, but how do you decide on the feature set? How do you decide to keep iterating and moving forward? How do you build essentially?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So when I think about this topic, I always get that South Park skit in my head where the government is this mystical place where they have robes and kill a chicken or turkey and then let the turkey run around this big board and see where it falls over, and then that's where they decide to raise interest rates. Oh, okay, that's the square. That it's this magical thing that ultimately seems kind of random at the end of the day. But no, okay. So for us, it actually it's a really good segue to all of the community talk from before,
Yeah.
because um, that's the only sane way I feel like to do tools specifically, of course, because we're not doing entertainment, we're doing something that needs to be immediately useful. So you can never ask somebody what is the tool that they would like to have, because you can't build immediately to people's needs. You have to talk to people and then kind of see what's behind those needs, and then build sort of for the bigger picture. But we always build together with our customers, or the community that maybe aren't our customers, but that we talk to all the time anyway. Like Slush was last week in Helsinki, so that was again
Yeah.
us hosting mixers, and in Hit Berlin we hosted a mixer just to be able to talk to people about what are they doing and what do they find frustrating or interesting, and like hopes and wishes and so on. And from there, what we try to do is build something that would ideally immediately allow a person using Metaplay to make a bigger game. It's a very simple goal at the end of the day. Does this allow our customers to make a bigger game in one way or another? And if the answer isn't a very clear yes, then we'll have a very tough discussion of like, well, why are we building this? Is it really good enough, or should we talk about this a little bit more so that it actually helps somebody do a bigger game? But then I, funnily enough, my personal decision making there at the end of the day is the same as it was in games, like very, very long time ago, where it's basically 1/3 of the strategic goal that I just mentioned, that ends up boiling down into some bigger feature initiatives. Like at the moment, I'm personally working on a live ops timeline, like a visual timeline that you can
Yeah.
see that kind of gives you an overview of all of the events that you've scheduled in your game over years and years and so on. Okay, so 1/3 of the effort must go into that because it's the most important thing. Then the other third goes into whatever is the quality of life stuff that our customers imminently need, because even if it doesn't feel like it's more important than the live ops timeline, they're asking for it, so it probably bothers them, so it's probably
Yeah.
important. So that's the sort of polish in a way. That third goes into polish, and then the last third goes into what your engineers want to do, regardless of if it's important or regardless of anybody asked for it. If they want to do it and they're clever, they probably want something that's worth doing. And that ends up being like fixing technical debt or automating tests or beautifying some APIs that they find really annoying, or like let them be clever, essentially. So sort
Yeah.
of reserving time for these three things in parallel in every single update incidentally worked for games fairly well and seems to work for us fairly well, if that makes
Nice.
sense.
No, it does. I mean, I think that's a really cool way of doing it. It's like got enough flexibility there that you can kind of pivot onto one thing versus the other. And I think a lot of the issues that I've seen in startup scale ups I've been in is especially that engineering point of view, where the engineers almost feel disconnected. I think this is a big issue in product teams and marketing teams specifically, is that you end up having these silos as you scale, and so
Yeah.
like that communication barrier is there. And a lot of the engineers kind of get into this phase of, I'm just doing a job here. I'm not getting to innovate or like stretch my skill set. So I think especially that one, I think it stuck out to me as like that's actually a really cool just initiative to have, to let them work on things like technical debt and all those things. Because like product teams don't necessarily always understand exactly what the scope of that is, right?
Well,
Neither do
yeah,
marketers.
absolutely. Yeah. Because they are the people who see the trees, and the product people, myself, the CEO, whatever, we only see the forest. We have no idea of the trees. So we'll have to. Um, I'm a big fan of the objectives, key results framework, as a general philosophy, where obviously you have a big objective, which is, say, um, for us, let's say that it boils down to the timeline feature as a grand objective that takes a year to build, and so on. And it boils down to key results, which are like the things that we actually have to ship for that timeline feature and all of its user stories to exist and actually achieve the goal of making it possible for game teams to see and understand and manage these massive roadmaps of content, whatever. So we boil that down into those key results. And now from the top level, the C level, we can kind of broadcast and over communicate this overarching goal of we have to make this type of live ops game development easy and fun, and this timeline is our best understanding of how to do it, and please do this. But while you're doing it, have a balanced mix of responding to feedback and a balanced mix of responding to your own urges. And
Yeah,
like give me a proposal that includes all of it. Go, you tell me how to optimize it. And
nice.
that feels like a healthy dynamic as well, because then you also kind of teach people all the time.
Yeah.
It's more collaborative. It includes people in a decision making rather than just telling them what we feel like should be the priority.
No, I mean, I really like that. I think a big problem that I've seen with other studios, and this is, I think, a very big thing with incumbent games, is a lot of people in like leadership perspectives, like there's often a lack of transparency. There's a lack of involvement with the wider team. Like you said, you're looking at the forest, but you kind of think you have the full picture with the forest, is what I've seen a lot of people think about that. So no, I really like that approach, and I think that's something like everyone can learn from, especially when they're growing as well, in terms of making sure everyone's engaged and learning and growing together, including yourself. On the flip side of that, though, so I'd be interested to know, just with Metaplay as you were building it, how did all these I mean, obviously the common thing with startups is fail fast and iterate, right? That's the basic sentiment. But how did you incorporate that in the building of things at Metaplay when you're building these feature set? What did you start with? How did you prove your hypothesis? How did you sort of continually evolve that product over time?
Yeah, yeah. So of course, Metaplay had a very similar start to any games company ever, meaning that before we had a company, we already had a bunch of stuff that existed. Like game teams always have prototypes, or you generally form around a very developed kernel of a thing already. So we had that. We had an actually working version of Metaplay's core system, which is the game server simulation. And we actually had to found the company, the legal entity, to send our first invoice to our first pilot customer. So that was like a nice circumstance, let's say, to found the
Yeah.
company. But to a question, kind of starting from there, um, we put a lot of effort into having pilot customers day zero, and like get a few more customers in during the first year, so that we would essentially be um, shipping all the time against a real world use case, and also asking for money immediately for what we're doing,
Nice.
so that we sort of have a full cycle of what our business needs to do, that we are exposed to the full cycle. We obviously gave very steep discounts. There wasn't a lot of money moving between companies at that time, but we had to set up billing pipelines, and but more to the point, we had to learn how to negotiate deals, how to structure contracts, and then how to justify our costs, whatever they were, um, throughout the quality of our work. So we were kind of dog fooding the business from day zero. And that feedback loop, I feel like, cuts the shit like nothing else does in terms of priorities and dead ends.
Hmm.
So essentially, we're bootstrapping. So that's, of course, what I'm describing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, that by doing that, by choosing to put ourselves into that position rather than, say, raising money, uh, it has forced us to very heavily focus on the things that actually provide immediate business value, so that our customers are willing to pay for it. And that when you rinse and repeat that loop for 5 years, you end up being end up having a lot of muscle memory around how to do that as an organization as well. That those discussions become a lot easier, and like so on. And we've had quite a few opportunities to raise money, um, and we haven't to date, because we are very afraid of losing that mode of working. So the moment we would have
Mm-hmm.
more money, then we would take sort of longer term bets that don't have to yield results immediately. And
Yeah.
so then we can kind of justify more exploratory, let's see if it happens to work out, which kind of reduces the feedback that you get, especially if there are new people to the company that are working on it, who can then kind of um, have almost like a hobby of developing cool tech that ultimately doesn't really do anything, but it's kind of a fun project.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a dark way of thinking about it, but you see that in games all the time, right? You raise a bunch of money, then people go off making fun game-like things, but the game doesn't ever come together really. There's like
Yeah.
you're eternally in that 90% done, because your people were just like making all kinds of interesting things, but not necessarily bringing it together into a very cohesive, tight experience. So I feel like on the danger of rambling, but I feel like what's really interesting is that bootstrapping, I found that to be just like the amazing cheat code, a life hack
Yeah.
to making a thing as a founder. And if and when I get back to games, I'd love to make games content. I would so much want to bootstrap that to have the same dynamic,
Yeah.
which is really difficult in games. But oh my
Oh
God,
yeah.
that if you imagine making a game and all the time having like a live feed into do people find my game worth paying for
Yeah.
while you develop it for 3 or 4 or 5 years, that would be so good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look at what was that? Like a Stardew Valley, right? That's essentially what that was. It was like a constant
And
feedback loop
Minecraft
throughout.
and
And Minecraft, yeah.
Farmville and yeah, all that.
So many big games. Yeah. No, I think just any tech product, right? Like it's always good to get that basis and iterate over time. But I think it is also this thing of like there's a danger that I've seen in game teams and other teams where you kind of need that cohesion through a unified vision and a mission in a way. Like without that kind of North Star, it's very hard to get people on the same page or get the ideation on paper. So I think it's very important to have that kind of written and said in terms of what you want to achieve. So I guess,
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And even in our company, as I said, the objectives, key results is a fantastic way of thinking about it. So the idea that we can't, for example, prioritize our backlog. We can't communicate to people what they should be working on unless we have a clear idea of what is the outcome that they should be delivering, i.e., the key result. And then why is that key result meaningful? Well, because it's part of this objective. So you kind of have to answer that. What are we building? And what does it look like if the thing has been built? What are the key results that make up the thing? And then we can go and talk about the tasks and so on. And you always are like um, very objective driven.
yeah,
That we sort of had that as well from like day one in the company, which happens less in games. But I feel like the best game teams are able to communicate their hypothesis, the creative vision very strongly. But it
no,
happens quite
absolutely.
rarely.
I think every game team could probably benefit from having the elevator pitch exercise there in terms of what they're actually building. If you can't
A
explain
hundred
it, then
percent.
just don't build it. But yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I guess on that front specifically for you, I guess what is the mission for Metaplay? Like where is the end goal?
Well, we absolutely want to be the default choice for anybody who is building a ambitious live service game. So is a little bit mushy as a statement, but for us, it sort of makes sense because what it means is that if I want to build a new game studio that wants to do like Factorio but MMO or something, like let's explore something that has millions of players and heavy simulation and nobody's ever done it before. Cool. Then you assume such a large mass of like operational systems for your studio to exist, like all of these game simulation and player persistence and live ops tools and customer support tools and analytics and whatever. That whole stack is kind of just given. So we want to be able to say, here you go. Like this is the best one that anybody's ever made. Go and do your game. So we want to be just so amazingly good at that that we become like the de facto tool choice in the industry. And the fun bit is that we don't yet even know what the tool looks like because it's we're inventing it as we go
Yeah.
together with all the feedback that we get. But that is to say that the ambition level is high, that we want to do something that change or helps change the industry or helps bring the industry forward like Unreal did and like Unity did, for example, but
Hmm.
specifically focusing on the most ambitious top crossing games and what those teams need. Mostly because it's good business, yes, but
Yeah.
also because I personally find people working in that problem space really interesting, and the projects in
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
space very interesting, because you're pushing
Yeah.
the envelope in so many different ways. So those are interesting problems to solve and sort of worthy problems to solve. Does that
Yeah.
answer the
Yeah.
question at all?
No, it does. It definitely does. I think that's the thing, right? Like you said, it's almost about that ambition. It's about being on the forefront of what's being innovative in this kind of dynamic field in a way, with what these kind of things people are trying to solve. And I think it's really fascinating that both like so the two companies I know in the space is you guys and then like Heroic, and then you're both essentially neither of you have taken investment. And I think what Metaplay has also had now like a 5 year development cycle, right? Like since you first started with
Yeah.
this. So it is just interesting to see that almost slow and steady change with these products rather than taking VC or taking funding where a lot of times they kind of push you to drive fast, grow, maybe, exit, whatever. So
Yeah,
it's just an interesting concept that both of these sort of game tech back end service provider companies, you're going in a more, I guess, stable slash low way of growing without having that external pressure to kind of move fast and scale and like just essentially lose control in a way, which I personally really like because I
yeah.
think that offers so much more dynamic like ways to explore this field and like you said, build that product over time in the way that you almost envision it rather than being pressured and pushed for it.
Yeah, the problem really is that it's one of those cases where multiple women don't give up birth to a single child faster. That there's just a process to polishing something.
Yeah.
So it, as in, time is a necessary part of the process of, say, making a system, letting developers make games on that system, then realize why the system is lacking in some way, make changes to it, then make more games with it, and iterate on it. And after a time, some parts of Metaplay have been stable for a while now, like years, so they're really good and probably will never change, like a fundamental programming model, for example.
Hmm.
And then there are other aspects of Metaplay where we want to essentially redo the system because now maybe the games industry has changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Actually, LiveOps is a really good example where our core wasn't LiveOps at all. It was the game server and its simulation and so on. And then we just ended up realizing that my subjective opinion is that LiveOps isn't something that you add on to a game, either in design or in technology, but it's something that is fundamentally how you build your game. So
Yeah.
then we realized that it's, for us at least, it is an extremely height integration between the systems. So we need to build both the live ops and we need to build both the server and we need to figure out how they fit together, essentially. That can never be the developer's problem. And that, as an example, that's something that we realized during these 5 years. And hence we ended up sort of dramatically expanding towards live ops, that we realized that we can't leave it to some other company to solve if we want
Hmm.
to have the
Hmm.
best possible experience around it. So it just
Nice.
takes time to realize those things. If we had
Yeah.
funding too early, then we would have potentially grown a company around the wrong vision and heavily accelerated towards that vision. And it could have made it maybe even impossible, but at least hard to then kind of back down and pivot to another direction and again go like maximum speed, 100 engineers on the problem type of thing.
Yeah.
That's it. I do think that there's, like with games, there is a time when growth money makes sense. At least the dynamic might make sense. That if we end up in a place where we have found the right systems, if you will, and the investments come back into games and so on, and we start to have an influx of people wanting to use Metaplay, maybe it makes sense for us to take investment, hire a lot of people, and just like accelerate in making the absolute best possible documentation humanity's ever seen on like how to make online and live ops games, because no such thing exists at the moment,
Yes.
or whatever else it may be, that we can say that this is it, let's make it the best, and like put 100 million behind it, localize it to all languages ever made so that the accessibility is there or whatever. It's kind of the same in games, right? Like once you
Yeah.
have that thing, then you pour insane resources into the art or ports to
Yes.
platforms or something.
No,
Um,
definitely. I think it's definitely a staggered approach. I guess to just round us out, then, like, where is Metaplay now? Where are you looking to go? Like, I know so far it's been very Finland focused in terms of your partners. What's next
right.
there?
Yeah, good question. So indeed, I'm happy to say that this year, our fifth year, we got more customers than all the previous years combined. There's probably a few
Nice.
reasons to it, but one of them is that we lowered our prices 80%. So we made the thing this year. We rolled Metaplay out as something that you can sign up to on a website and download and give it a go for the first time. Like previously, we were sort of invite only, if you will. Now we're a little bit more open. And what we are working on right now, aside from ever deeper features, like I mentioned, the live up stuff that I'm personally working on, but there's just loads more where that came from. We are Our plan is to drop our pricing another 80%, maybe early next year if we
Oh
get it
wow.
done.
Okay.
Um, and how we do it is basically understanding what a new game development team needs, and then making that as simple as possible to the point where they don't need our help anymore. and thus we can make it cheap for them. One of those, enter credit card, press button, get servers, and that will work for you. And it's going to be like easy and cost effective for us to provide and for you to use. Ta-da, we can make it cheap. So that's imminently what we're doing next, than making this way, way, way more accessible. Um, Specifically, here's a fun learning. One of the mistakes that I personally did in the early Metaplay was to kind of look at top crossing game teams, and in those top crossing game teams, Supercell, EA, whatever, you generally have uh, these big needs like owning your own infrastructure, owning your own databases, and being able to manage your own servers in-house, all that, because it's your billion-dollar business hinges on these things. It's business continuity and also other needs. You will want to do it, okay? But at the same time, look at today, whether it's Supercell or whoever we might be talking to, new startup, they absolutely never ever do not want to manage their own infrastructure or servers or
Yeah.
databases because it's way too much work and they don't know how.
Yes.
So we need to figure out, or we have been for years figuring out how to give you a product that has the sort of SaaS self-service feeling of like, yeah, just use it and stuff magically works. And then as you develop your game and you develop your studio and hopefully find a hit product at some point, whatever is your platform, then we help you transition your studio. As we discussed earlier, we help you
Yeah.
transition from this prototype team into a more serious, polished operation and help you adopt these processes like being able to manage your own servers or being really good at deploying updates without breaking the game, that sort of thing. We'll teach you how. and that's
Nice.
what we've been doing for a very long time. And now we're hoping to make that knowledge more widely available through our blogs and documentation and just like more opinionated products. I'm sure that's going to take, well, our next year is going to be that. But then the future, again, tell me in 2 years if we actually end up doing any of this stuff, is to go, of course, supporting other engines and more platforms and just like make sure that we exist wherever you want to make games, assuming that you want to make top crossing, live service games. So I think, yeah, that's already, oh my God, so much work. That's what we're going to do
Yeah.
next. And most of our
Always.
customers nowadays are international instead of Finnish. So
Oh,
that's already
nice.
happened.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, it seems like a really cool journey. The product is amazing, and obviously you know a lot. So it's just this conversation alone, I'm like blown away by just a lot of the things that I've come across. It's really fun been talking with you. I think this could have really gone on forever, but
Yeah,
I
likewise.
think
It's
we're
been fun.
probably at time. But yeah, I guess just to finish it off, then, what are you most excited for in the industry, or just generally in the tech space right now?
Yeah, good question. There's a bunch of stuff. I am honestly, I guess, most intrigued. I'm not excited because all disappointments start by getting excited, but I'm definitely actively intrigued in the practical AI promise.
Hmm.
So I'm not an AI believer. That's not I'm not about the hype, but it does feel like it has this sort of transforming or empowering possibility
Yeah.
that if it comes to pass, then it's going to be such a cool thing for our business.
Yes.
So I'm super excited to see if it pans out, even if we are not particularly the company pushing it.
Hmm.
Even the smallest things like so I host a games leadership conference, but like to talk about games leadership and all this stuff that we've been talking today. And one thing that I don't like is that we generally in games don't have a lot of coaching available for people. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we might have knowledge available, we might help out, but we generally are really bad at coaching people. And that's like about the most important thing you could do. Again, performance management. So AI is actually already today pretty good at giving you completely individualized feedback. For example, what if we take this discussion right now and I'll, whenever it comes out, I'll take the recording, put it analyze it into a transcript, put that onto Claude or ChatGPT or something, and ask it to give me feedback of how would I improve this
Hmm.
discussion. I'm scared about the results already. That's a
Yeah.
vulnerable thing. But how amazing is that as a potential? So I'm really excited by the potential of being able to do that for all of our employees, for myself, at basically no cost from a business point of view. Uh,
Yeah.
and that could be big. Yeah, let's see.
No, definitely. I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I was at this YC event this last weekend, and it was all about AI. It was all about how we're basically essentially at the internet bubble again in terms of the change that's
Oh,
going to happen
absolutely.
to our lives and how we're going to work. And
And
I mean, I'm very excited. I mean, already looking at how far it's come in just like 2 years, right? It's been 2 years since like ChatGPT actually got released, and like the world is a very different place technologically now. Like there's
it is,
so
it
much
is.
happening. So
But
yeah,
that said,
this.
I'm also obliged to say that I'm actually kind of excited for a bunch of the games that our customers are doing because I do get to see their
Okay.
pitches and get to see what's coming out. Some of it is AI driven, yes, but more to the point, there are still new games coming out that nobody's
Hmm.
ever seen, new types of entertainment. Yeah, some of it is like a nuance, or like a new spin on existing
Okay.
concepts, but some of them are honestly like they feel fresh. So I'm just super excited that
Nice.
sure, of course, the games that our customers are doing, but I'm excited to be excited about the new game that I haven't played yet. That feeling, I'm sure it's gonna keep on happening. So just like looking forward to seeing what's the next Fortnite and have that moment of like, oh my God, the industry changed.
Nice. Yeah, no, that's exciting to hear. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes up now. So let's see. It's been a slow year for me in terms of games. So yeah, that definitely excites me as well. I'm really hoping to see something big. So yeah,
Yeah.
any last things you want to shout out before we end this?
Yeah, making games is hard. You should use Metaplay. Um, so there's that. But also, if any of the listeners are ever over in Finland, obviously reach out to us. If nothing else, we can do some intros and come visit IGDA and just let's have a beer. Let's talk about this stuff. It's good.
Yeah. No, it's been amazing. This has been an amazing conversation. Thanks so much for joining me, Timu. Like I know I've definitely learned a lot, and it's just really good talking with you pretty much all the time. I think we end up just on kind of the most random rambles, and it ends up being something useful and something just very unique. So thank you so much for your time. Of
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
course.